I'm Sri. As Cheryl said, I'm the owner and founder of Upahar. And I thought I would start today by describing my interpretation of what a social enterprise is, what makes Upahar a social enterprise, what we do when we focus on the nature of the problem that we're trying to solve, challenges that we face trying to solve the problem, and where we are today, having been in business for about 4 years now. So the concept of social enterprise, I was first introduced to it when I heard Muhammad Yunus talk about it at the Lancaster Chamber annual dinner in 2008. And the way he described it was, it's really simple. It's using a for-profit business model to address a social issue, any kind of social issue. So I took that because it was really accessible to me as, it's a simple concept. You create a business using the for-profit business model, and instead of just focusing on profit, you have a mission to do something else, which is solve a social issue. So using that, I founded Upahar, and the problem, the social challenge that we chose to focus on was employment, because way back in 2008-09, there was a Great Recession and everybody was having a hard time finding a job, and people with barriers to workforce entry were having an especially harder time. And so the concept was, what kind of business can we form that would provide employment opportunities, paying living wages to this group of people who would otherwise have a difficult time getting jobs. Getting jobs, paying living wages, I think that kind of goes together. And so I founded Upahar as to be in the food business, not necessarily restaurant at the time. We were just a catering business, to generate work for people who already had the skills to cook, and we offered flexible time. So there are many different types of people who have different kinds of barriers to workforce entry. We chose to focus on just one segment of the population. We chose to focus on the refugees, with the intention that over time, once we worked out the kinks with one group, then we could look at opening up to other groups of people. So let me talk about the refugee population and what their particular challenges are, and then I'll talk about how Upahar tries to address them. So Lancaster has a refugee population, a very significant refugee population. We have been settling about 500 new people in this area every year. So, and this is at least since 2009. So that's a sizable number of people who have come into this area with the refugee status. So refugee, how many people are familiar with refugees versus other immigrants? Not many? Okay. So refugees are legal immigrants. They apply for immigrant status based on persecution from their home countries. So the refugees in the Lancaster area are primarily from Bhutan, where they're ethnic Nepalis from Bhutan, and they had to leave Bhutan due to ethnic cleansing. There are people from Iraq and Syria due to the war. There are people from the Democratic Republic of Congo, also displaced due to war, and others from smaller populations from other parts of the world. So these people apply for refugee status to the U.S., apply to come into the U.S. as refugees, and if granted refugee status, it's an immigrant visa, so they come in with the ability to work. And there are 2 agencies in the city that help resettle them. So the refugees have 90 days, 3 months, to come in, find a house, get a social security card, register their children in school, find a job, get settled in those 90 days. They have a lot of help from the agencies, but 90 days is not a very long time. And so even though these people may be coming in with a lot of skills, many of them used to have jobs and professional lives in their countries, the biggest barrier that they face when they come here is language. So many of the people from Iraq, for example, used to be teachers and engineers or wherever, but here they cannot do what they used to do because they don't have the language skills. So, but they are under pressure to get a job so that they can be self-sustaining within the 90 days. So here enter Upahar. So we work with these two agencies to offer jobs to their refugee clients. And we are structured so that our intention is to provide a job that the people who are willing to do it can do without having to know English or do a lot of customer service. So all of the jobs are cooking jobs. And we try to make it meaningful by saying, you can cook the food that you know. We will celebrate your culture and heritage and have you share your family recipes with our customers. So it's not just any cooking job, it has a tie back to their identity and who they are. And we offer living wages so that it's a job that doesn't pay minimum wage, that they may be able to actually live on it. So what do we have so far? So on paper, this sounded really good, that we would offer jobs paying living wages to people to do what they could do, and we would make a difference to this group of people who would otherwise not be able to play on equal footing in this community, so they could kind of become self-sustaining, financially stable community members. Well, on paper that sounded good, but there were three big challenges that we faced right off the bat. One was the welfare system. So within 90 days, if they don't get a job, the refugees go into the welfare system so that they can get assistance while they're still looking for jobs. If they get a job, they have to take the job, or they're compelled to take the job because they don't want to be on welfare. But working with us at the time when we first started, we had a catering business, so the hours were fluctuating. And the welfare office did not have a way to calculate benefits for fluctuating hours. How many hours a week do you work? 5 hours, 10 hours? I don't know. If you have a good week and we have a good, many catering gigs, then it could be 20 hours. On another week, it could be 0. This created chaos, havoc with the employees because on one hand, their benefits would be cut. On the other hand, on some weeks, they wouldn't be generating enough income to pay their bills. So that was the biggest challenge that almost shut down the business right off the bat. The other two were transportation and communication, things that we take for granted. We have an email and cell phone and drive here and there. This population, they don't have cars, they don't have licenses, they usually don't have cell phones, they certainly don't have email, and if they had email, then there is that language barrier. So communication and coordination was also another challenge. And then finally, working with the market, so the perception, you have refugees producing food, so it must be really cheap. Well, it can't be cheap, because then I can't pay living wages. And so if it's not cheap, then the expectation is that it's high-end. Well, we can't do that either because our people don't have the language and the service skills to be able to deliver that. So that brings us to where we are today. We have a restaurant today to address these three problems. And the first of which is to offer stable work hours to everyone who works at Upahar. So everybody comes in and works, 25 hours or however many hours, and they can earn a living that is appropriate for them to live on. So as a single person, they can work 25 hours and be self-sufficient. And we have to be open every day, whether one person comes to the restaurant or 40 people. So that's my problem to figure out. But for the employees, they don't have to fight with or not know whether or not they're going to get benefits or whether they're going to have a steady income or not. So that problem is addressed by having a restaurant. It's on the bus route, so people can take the bus and come to work. We figure out the work shift according to the bus schedule, so they can get to work and leave work and have transportation to and from. And as far as expectation is concerned from the general community members, we have carved out a space where we are not fast food like McDonald's and we are not high-end like Gibraltar. We've created an environment where you can meet the people, learn about the food, have an authentic cultural experience, but it still be affordable. So we're experimenting with a blend of quick service and table service, and for those who are ready to do so, bringing them out and saying, come meet the customers and try it out, and it's okay if you stumble. So not everybody is willing to do that, but those who are have the opportunity, and those who aren't still do the behind-the-scenes work. So that's how we have adapted, and that's how we have focused the business to really, keep focused on the mission. That yes, we could do many things, and we could do it in many different ways, but what serves the population that we're trying to serve? So we are in the business of producing food so that the people who we employ can have a job. So having that focus in mind helps us make decisions that are different from perhaps other businesses. So it keeps our price at a particular level, it keeps our service at a particular in a particular manner, and our menu. People come in and asking for chicken tikka masala, and sorry, I'm Indian, my restaurant is not. This is what we offer, and this is the menu for a reason. So I'll stop here so the others can have a chance to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel inspired already, and we're only a third of the way through, so thanks. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Jonathan Coleman. He's Program Director for Assets Lancaster, and he helped me put this program together, and I truly appreciate that. He holds an MBA in Economic Development from Eastern University and is fluent in Spanish. He has a strong belief in the power of business to help facilitate positive societal change on a local, national, and international level, and I'm going to get his PowerPoint together for him.
Great. He's a bit shorter than I am. Alright, so what I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about today is how to fight inequality through one particular avenue, one particular type of programming, microlending. So, but to do that, before we do that, let me just kind of explain who I am and what we do, what the organization I work for does. I work for Assets Lancaster. We believe that we can use business as a force for good, and so we have different programs that try to do that. The different programs include learning circles, which are like training programs, lending circles, which is what I'm talking about today. We have leadership-focused programs. We have a strong focus on social enterprise, as Sri kind of discussed it already. And we have a focus on South Lancaster City and the economic development of that part of the city, which is the impoverished side of town. All right, so talking about inequality. I know the conference is about inequality broadly. For my purposes, I want to spend most of my time talking about income inequality. So I'm going to get a little bit like economics wonky on you. I'm going to step away. Hopefully you can hear me. But in order to measure income inequality, economists have come up with this really neat thing called the Gini coefficient, which is basically a number that tells you how unequal a society is from the richest to the poorest. Where is the bulk of the population at? So as you see here, they take this coefficient, they put it in the list, and they call it the Gini index, measuring that gap between rich and poor. In the United States, number one is the most unequal, down to like number 150 or whatever is the most equal societies, most equal countries. We're number 41. So we're the 41st most unequal country in the world. Maybe it doesn't seem so bad until you start looking at our neighbors in that space, right? So we're slightly more equal than, Russia, South Sudan, Jamaica, Bulgaria. We're actually less equal than the Philippines, Cameroon, Iran, Kenya. Actually, I said Russia down there. We're actually less equal than Russia. Nigeria, right? So that's not good company really to be in. The other rich countries in the world are way down here, somewhere down here below the floor. So it's a problem. There's a lot of reasons for it, but it's something that needs to be considered and addressed in some way. So why is the disparity? Why are there so many people in the US, in our country, which is a really, really wealthy country, right? Why are there so many people in that bottom level? Well, one reason is that it's just really expensive to be poor. There's a lot of things that are keeping poor people poor. So, if you don't have a bank account, which is a problem that a lot of people who are living in poverty deal with, that means in order to cash a paycheck, you're paying 2% to the check cashing place. In order to pay a bill, you're paying potentially $3 for a money order to pay any bill that you have to pay. Those are dollars and cents that people who are living in poverty need to hold on to. Those are dollars and cents that me, in my comfortable middle class life, don't have to pay. So it costs more for a poor person to live just kind of everyday life than it does for someone in the middle class or up from there. So you don't have a car. All right, that means you're shopping probably at the corner store down the street, as opposed to the grocery store, which is several miles away. And it means you're paying 20, 30, 40, 50% more for any products, and there's probably not a lot of healthy stuff around. And you're wasting time to get anywhere, relying on public transport. So that's keeping you from potentially taking an extra job or spending extra time with your family. What else? You don't have any savings. That means you're living potentially month to month, meaning like in kind of the budget hotels or whatever, monthly rental hotels, because you can't afford a down payment on an apartment or a house. It also means you're always renting. You're never buying a house, which means you're never building assets, which means that money that you pay every month is just getting thrown away. And if you have a medical emergency, and you don't have insurance, or your insurance is bad, there's no way you're going to be able to pay the bills. Those bills immediately are going to go to collections. Not immediately, but with some time, you're going to go to collections, which means you have credit companies kind of chasing after you, trying to get you to pay your bills, and your credit score is negatively affected. So when you have bad credit, which comes from any number of things, such as medical bills, such as student loan payments you can't repay, things like that, you're relying, in order to get money from somewhere in case of emergency or in case of kind of a necessity, a lot of times you're relying on payday lenders, which can charge crazy amounts of interest, up to 450% on loans. Payday lenders basically lend money to people based on the money they're going to get paid later. So you have to show them your pay stubs, and they give you that amount up front, and you pay that amount back plus a large percentage later. So also if you have bad credit, that means if you need to get a car, you maybe finally saved enough money to buy a car, or put it like a down payment on a car, you need to get a loan for the rest, you're going to be paying 20 to 30% in interest. We bought a car a few years ago, we paid like 6 to 7% as someone in the middle class. So again, it's expensive to be poor. What does that do? It keeps poverty there. It keeps people who are living in poverty from making their way out of that situation that they're in. It doesn't seem right, right? It doesn't make sense that someone who's living in poverty should be paying more for general services than I pay in kind of my comfortable middle class existence. All right, so is there a solution? There's lots of potential solutions. What we focus on here is microfinance, basically meaning financial services for the poor. And getting equal access to those financial services, regardless of income level, race, gender, etc. So, I'm going to go history teacher a little bit now and step back and to kind of explain where this world of microfinance comes from. Started off with the idea of a ROSCA, stands for Rotating Savings and Credit Association. So basically, like hundreds and thousands of years before now, there weren't many banks around, especially or any places to kind of access financial services, especially in rural, poor communities around the world. So these communities started developing these ROSCAs. They're basically informal savings clubs. Is anyone here not from the US? We're all Americans here? Okay, so these things are in countries all around the world. They all have different names, like Tanda, Sociedad, San, Susu. There's a lot of different names for these circles, these lending groups or savings groups. They basically work like this. So we have, in this group, this example, we have 4 members of the group. John, Mark, Carol, Linda. So month 1, everyone puts in $10. So you have a pot of $40. John takes the $40 out. He uses it for himself. Month 2, everyone puts in $40 again, including John, who already got his money out, right? But Mark takes the money this time. Month 3, do the same thing. Linda takes the money. Month 4, Carol takes the money. So basically, John got a loan, right? Up front, he got $40 without having put anything in. But the people in his community, the other 4 in the group, trust John to repay. So they essentially gave him a loan up front, and then they trust for him to repay for the rest of the time that the group exists, right? Now Carol at the other end, she essentially had a savings account. She put $10 in every month until finally it was her turn to pull it out at the end, right? So this is essentially like a community banking model that developed organically all around the world, where there weren't more traditional institutions to handle this kind of thing. So that's the idea. That's the beginnings of what we call microfinance. Then, Sri mentioned this guy, a guy over here on your right, named Muhammad Yunus, founded a bank called the Grameen Bank. He basically took that idea of this community-based like savings and lending circle that had already been existing in Bangladesh, where he is from, and he formalized it, and he expanded it, and found out a way to use that idea of lending and saving within community and take it kind of on a huge scale. So basically, he set up a system where he's giving small loans to groups of women. Women tend to repay a lot better than men, and tend to use the money that they make for their family as opposed to for like partying and drinking and things. So he focused primarily on women, giving loans to these women so they can start small businesses for themselves. All right? These women didn't have collateral, certainly, meaning they didn't have anything backing the loan that they were given. They didn't have a history in business. They didn't have a lot of experience. But what they did have is community connections. They had this community, this group that they were together with from their family, from their neighbors, from other people in the village. So Yunus figured out a system where he could give a loan to these ladies who were unlendable otherwise, but set it up so that everyone who was in the group was responsible for the loans of everyone else in the group. So if someone didn't repay their loan, everyone else in the group was responsible to repay. So there was a lot of community responsibility in that model, right? So it meant that he could lend this money to these ladies without the typical collateral that's needed, or without like the typical underwriting if you're in like the banking world. So that's kind of the model that Grameen Bank used in the 70s and 80s, and then blew up from there. To the point where today there's over 10,000 microfinance institutions in the world. It's a big, 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 big industry. Hundreds of billions of dollars industry. Some examples, Bank Rakyat in Indonesia has 30 million clients. Most of them are dealing in programs or models similar to the one that Yunus established, and dealing with hundreds, potentially thousands of dollars at the max, is kind of the money that they're dealing with. That's why they call it microfinance. Another good example is Hope International. Who's heard of Hope International? Anyone from Lancaster? They're based here, not in Millersville, but in the county. So they're faith-based microfinance institution, but they essentially do the same thing that Grameen Bank does around the world. All right, but that's international. So let's take it home. We've got this whole stuff that's been happening around the world for 30, 40 years. Hasn't really happened here. Not much anyway. So before we get into how we're making it happen here, let's talk about South Lancaster City for a minute. So who else been to Lancaster City, right? You've been downtown? You guys like go down there on the weekends and have a good time, whatever. You see these maps everywhere. A map of our city, right? For tourists, people who want to learn more about the city. Those maps, if you look at them, they only show half the city. They only show the northern half of the city. So we have one of those outside my office. I live on Vine Street, which is we work on Vine Street, which is 1 block south of King Street. So we work just south of kind of the center of town. And the map right outside the office, it only shows the northern half of town. So I walk out my office, I look left, I see Town Square, I see Central Market, I see the Marriott, whatever, all the stuff that's downtown. And that's what the map right there shows. I turn right, I see thousands of houses, I see tens of thousands of homes, lives, people there. I see hundreds of businesses. They're on the map. They're not there. It's like the city or the county or the tourist board doesn't want the tourists to know there's actually another half of the city that exists. Why not? I don't know. Is it because almost half, 40% of the people live in poverty there? Maybe. Is it because almost 60% of the businesses are minority owned? They wouldn't say that, but it makes one wonder, right? So we're trying to address that situation. We want to like put the south side of the city back on the map. And in general, kind of minority owned and lower income businesses back on the map. So, when I talk about micro business, these are the majority of the businesses that are in the south side of the city are micro businesses. These are businesses that have fewer than 5 employees. So really, really small businesses, which is 90% of the businesses in the country. That's a lot. And they bring 4.87 trillion into the economy. So if 1 in 3 micro businesses in our country hired 1 extra employee, we would be at full employment, meaning there wouldn't be any unemployment in our country. So, with that in mind, it seems like an obvious solution, right? Like, let's try to support these micro businesses. Let's help them grow so that they can maybe add an employee. And if those add an employee, we really start dealing with some of the problems. But it's not so easy. In order to grow a business, typically you need capital. You need money in order to grow. There's ways to grow organically and slowly, but typically you need some cash from somewhere, typically a bank. But it's hard. It's hard for these micro businesses to access money. Why? Because a lot of them have bad credit. A lot of the owners of these businesses have poor credit. They're lower income themselves, so all those reasons that I said it's hard to be poor, they're dealing with, right? So a lot of times that affects their credit history. These businesses have poorly recorded financial statements, meaning like they don't keep their books very, very good. It's typically like money comes in the business and it's spent at home that night for dinner, and it's all kind of in one account or like flowing in and out very quickly, and there's not a lot of like, formalization of keeping the books. There's typically not collateral, so these are people that don't own houses to use as collateral to get a loan. A lot of times they're leasing their building, they don't have a lot of equipment. And a lot of these businesses are pretty new, so they don't have a long history of kind of being in business and making money. So all that means banks aren't going to give them loans, basically, or very few. So what we're trying to do is take this idea that Muhammad Yunus thought of 40 years ago in Bangladesh, and which has since blown up into kind of a huge industry internationally, and bring it here to the US. So we have what we call our microloan lending circle program. Built on the same idea as the model that Grameen Bank Muhammad Yunus has been using for a while. And what do? We provide capital, money, provide training, ongoing training. The repayment is a project. The repayment time is a year, so we have monthly meetings throughout the year where training is involved. We improve credit. One of the beautiful things about doing this kind of lending in the US is that if you lend to someone and they repay you, and you report that to the credit agencies, it starts bumping up their credit. That's something that the international context isn't able to do as well, because they don't have the whole credit system that we have here in the developed world. We also create a community, so we're lending to a group of people at once in a lending circle, meaning we have a group of small entrepreneurs all kind of in it together, learning from each other, working together, building together. So a lot of times, as Sri can probably speak to this, an entrepreneur is on an island by themselves. They don't have a lot of support, so we create like a support system. And we provide a stepping stone, or act as a stepping stone to larger amounts of financing. Because we're improving credit, because we're creating an opportunity to build a history of repayment for businesses, so that they can show a financial institution, a more normal place like a bank, that they are able to repay and they do repay. So we keep those records, so they're able to show that they are responsible with repayment. And we help them organize their books so that they can show cash flow and they can show that their building is growing or that their business is growing. So we act as a stepping stone. So hopefully someone comes into our program for 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, and graduates on and goes on to Fulton Bank or Susquehanna or Bank of America or what have you, and gets a loan from someone else, more traditional loan. So a little bit about how the program works. We form a group of entrepreneurs, somewhere between 8 and 15 people. We provide like one-on-one credit counseling sessions. We pull their credit, we see what's wrong. It's almost always really bad. Almost always has to do with 2 things: medical collections and student loans. And those are things that they're not as a result of irresponsible spending, right? So sometimes people have high credit card bills because they like to go shopping on the weekends and they can't really afford it, right? Most of what we see is not that. Most of it has to do with circumstances outside of their control or attempts to make their life better, such as with taking student loans so that they can get a better education. But then they never quite graduate, or even if they do graduate, the job that they have doesn't pay enough to actually pay off the loans, so they end up kind of going into default. We extend the loan to all the group members. It's under $5,000, typically the $1,200 or $3,600 in the first round. Like I said, we have monthly meetings as the repayment takes place, and we offer, once a year of repayment has been made, so one loan has been paid off, we offer the opportunity for these groups to move on to access more money. Maybe $5,000 year 2, $10,000 year 3, 15, up to that level. All right. So the big key of this, how does it work? The people that we're giving money to, again, these are uncollateralized loans, meaning there's nothing backing these loans. The same as the UNIS model. Nothing backing the loans. They're not creditworthy. They're what we call subprime borrowers, meaning their credit score is below like a certain level where they're very, very risky borrowers. And almost no one will give them access to money, except for like the payday loans and things like I mentioned before. So we mitigate the risk of that by having this group guarantee, meaning everyone in the group, all 10 people in the group, guarantee the loan of everyone else in the group. So if someone does default in their loan, the other 9 people are responsible to repay that loan. That's scary for people, but a lot of times this is their only way to start building the steps to actually accessing capital moving forward, to actually growing their business moving forward, so they're willing to take that risk. But there's this great peer pressure to repay. They all know each other. By the time we give them a loan, we have like a process of them like getting to know each other, so they're friends, hopefully, enough to where they don't want to let everyone else in the group down, so they do repay. Even if business isn't going well, they find a way to repay the loan. And also, if someone is struggling in the group, and maybe their marketing is not up to par, or they need help kind of bringing in new sales, or any kind of issue that they may be having, there's 9 other people who have a really vested interest in their success, right? So someone is struggling with something, you've tried something that worked in your own business, so you're not going to keep that to yourself, because you really want that person to succeed. Why? Because if they succeed, they're going to repay the loan, and you don't have to cover that for them, right? So there's this kind of community that's built of working together, helping each other grow their businesses, because they all have a vested interest in their success. So it's pretty cool. A little bit of the details, like I said, the loans are under $5,000. Term is 1 year. The interest rate is 9%, which is like higher than like a mortgage. If you see the mortgage rates, typically are like 4 or 5%, something like that. But it's a typical business loan rate, and it's a really low rate for these kind of loans, like these dollar amounts. Basically means if you get a $1,200 loan from us, you pay $104 a month, and it's $60 in interest over the year. So it's pretty affordable. The benefits, again, getting the capital, you getting the training and technical assistance from us, building credit, creating and strengthening the business and social networks, and you have hopefully accessing more money moving forward. So the results. Our partner in this program, actually the ones who kind of started doing it, the group called Finanta out of Philadelphia, they have been doing these kind of loans for about 3 years, have lent out $1.5 million through their microloan program. Their default rates are less than 3%. These are with very, very, very risky borrowers that won't get a loan from anyone else. And the default rates are extremely low. Default rates meaning people who don't pay, right? In our program, we made our first loans about 7 or 8 months ago now. After 6 months, 75% of our recipients had increased their credit score, because they were repaying our loan and because we had worked with them to figure out what the issues were on their credit report and help them take care of some of those issues. Which means that they can maybe get a car loan at a better rate already than they would have been able to before, which is going to save them dollars and $20 and $50, whatever, every month in their repayment. Which means that eventually their score is going to be high enough where they can get through past the secretary at the bank, maybe have a potential to actually get a larger loan so they can really grow their business. So in our short time period, it's been really successful. So that is it. That's kind of what we do, and how our little corner of the fight against inequality in our little city of Lancaster is working on this lending circle model and providing the opportunities to folks who typically wouldn't have that, and hopefully getting them into that system, and hopefully getting them moving up on that scale, the inequality scale, or the income level scale, so that the disparity between rich and poor isn't quite so strong, at least in our own little community. So thank you.
So we are going to hold questions to the end, but we really encourage questions. We'd love to have a conversation after this is all over, a little bit more informally. Our third and final presenter is Kate McGough. She's a social return on investment analyst with Success Markets, Inc., a 501c3 nonprofit that helps charities find inexpensive ways to measure the value they create for those in need and to help funders obtain this information for use in their giving. She holds an MA in International Development and received her SROI network training in England in 2008. Get back to the beginning here. So as Sri and Jonathan have shown, business can be done in a very socially impactful way with the capacity to influence all kinds of issues, including things like inequality. But the question then becomes, how do we determine the impact that we're having? How do we demonstrate it to others, and how do we use it to plan and see what areas we're doing really well in and what areas we may need to improve in? So if you wanted to choose a business to invest in, based on a traditional business model. So you're looking at two different restaurants, trying to decide which one you'd like to invest in. What do you need to know? You want to know how much money you're going to get, right? What's the bang for your buck? How much do you have to invest, and how much money will you get based on that investment? So here you can see you'd obviously want to invest in restaurant A. So if you're deciding, so this is traditional ROI. Return on investment, looking at how much money I make compared to how much money I have to invest. So if you'd like to invest in a business based on more than just the profit, if you're looking at investing in a business because you want to have social impact, then what do you want to know about this business? Do you still want to know how much bang you'll get for your buck? What about a business like Sri's? How do you demonstrate not just the profit, but also the impact that you're having on the people you're working with? And there are a lot of ways to do this. You've probably seen organizations like Hope International who tell a lot of stories about the clients they work with. So they show pictures, videos, they give testimonials. This is Sally before we worked with her. She was really sad, she didn't have a job. This is Sally now. She has a job, she makes a great wage, she can take care of her family. And those are really powerful. But in the business world, people like to see hard data too. So, about 14 years ago, a San Francisco-based philanthropic organization slapped an S in front of the ROI and started looking into how do we measure the social return on our investment? What might that look like? So they started experimenting with different methodologies for this. And it's become a very popular tool. It's been adapted by an organization called the Social Return on Investment Network, and that is an international network now with hundreds of practitioners globally, and they continue to standardize this process and promote it all around the world. So social return on investment is how many dollars of social return do I get per dollar of investment, or per donation if we're talking about a charity. And for the purpose of this conversation today, I'm going to talk about this specific number ratio calculation. Now, SROI analysis itself includes all of the context that surrounds that. So you include those qualitative changes, the stories from the people you're interacting with, the methodology of how you collected your data. It all comes in a thick report based on all of the work you've done. But today I'm just going to talk about the calculation itself primarily. So there are 7 main principles to social return on investment. The first is that you involve the stakeholders. You meet directly with those people that you're trying to influence to understand the way that they're changing, the way
way the organization or the business creates a change. And you can do that through focus groups, through dialogue, through surveys, anything like that. Then you need to understand what those changes are so that you can start to figure out the scope of your study. So what things do you need to include in this and what things can be left out? And then that can all feed into investors investing in your business or the leadership in your business deciding which direction to go in the future. Once you know the things that you change, you need to focus on how you're going to value them, and that's what we'll talk about in just a minute. You want to include only what's material, so only what is going into those changes and not the irrelevant pieces. And a huge part of this is never overclaiming. So you can probably imagine that this is a very subjective calculation, so there are times when you need to make assumptions about the things you're valuing. Whenever you make an assumption in this field, you always need to make it very conservatively. So once you give your final calculation, you want to know that it is at least this value. You never want to overstate. So you want to say something like, I know that for every dollar invested in this, there is at least $3 of social change. There could be as much as 10, but I know that there's at least 3 because I made very conservative assumptions. Again, you need to be transparent, so where you do make those assumptions, you want to state in your report that those assumptions were made, and you always want to have your report verified by an external source. Now, there are organizations that do not follow these principles exactly. I'll talk a little bit about some of the limitations of them at the end. And so there's some organizations that are experimenting with different ways of doing SROI to help with those limitations, but I won't get into that right now. So I'm sorry, I know this is the second day and I have to show you spreadsheets, but hopefully it won't be too painful. The first stage of the analysis, again, is looking at the stakeholders. Who do we have an effect on? What are the unintended and intended changes? What do we think we're doing for them? Then we need to look at the inputs. So how much budget is required to complete this task? Then the outputs. What are we doing? Are we providing a job, skills training, mentoring? What are those tangible outputs that we're delivering? Once we know what those are, we can track down what are the outcomes. So what are the actual changes? Once we know what changes, we need to know how to measure it. So if we're looking at something like an addiction treatment facility, what is the thing we need to measure? That is our indicator. So if we want to look at something like how many folks who go through this addiction treatment program remain clean. So then we need to source, well, how do we find that information? Do we go to the charity or the business and find out there are hard data on how many of those people remained clean? How many people were there, the quantity, the duration. Did they remain clean for 6 months, for 2 years? That's really important data for the calculation. And when did the outcomes start? Did it start immediately? Did it start 4 years later after someone went through college? Then the most important part of this calculation is finding a financial proxy. So we need to connect that outcome to something financial. So we need to find something to compare the value to. So maybe with this example of addiction, it's a research study that talks about the cost of addiction to society and to the person per year. So cost savings from things like the justice system or social services of a baseline group of folks that aren't addicted compared to people who are addicted. So you use that value and then you include the source of where the value comes from. And the final stage in the process of the calculation, I'm not going to go into detail on, but you do need to make some adjustments to show what would have happened anyway without the activity. There are people who would have succeeded at this even if you hadn't intervened. Who else may have contributed to this change? And then how many folks drop off that outcome? So maybe after 1 year, 50% of the people in the addiction treatment program were clean, but after 2 years, only 25% of them were still clean. So those are all things that are subtracted out of your measurement before you get your final impact. So here's just a really simplistic example of how we determine the total benefits, not the final calculation, but the total benefits created by an intervention or a program. So if we're we're thinking about a business that hires folks coming out of prison, and we know they have 8 employees who come out of prison, and that 70% of those employees have stayed out of prison. So they've had them for a year or 2 working for them, and we know that there's been only 30% recidivism. 70% of the employees have stayed out of prison. Then we do some research to determine, well, what's the baseline? How many of them would have stayed out of prison even if they weren't part of our program? And we found that, these aren't real numbers, by the way, these are made-up numbers for this. So if you know anything about recidivism, these rates might not be accurate. But we might find that 50% of them likely would not have gone back to prison anyway. So that means we have a 20% margin in our success rate, that we likely impacted 20% of those people who would have gone back to prison but didn't because of the programming we provided. Then we look into the average length of jail time for this demographic and this type of crime. So I'm using the number 30 days at a cost of $150 per day. Now you would use a legitimate source for this if this was a real study. But then we have this value of if these folks stay out of jail, then they're saving society $4,500 for each person who remains out of jail. So you can see the calculation below. 20% this is kind of a wonky example. It's about 1 point something, just under 2 people have remained out of jail likely because of this programming. So that's a total value of $7,200. So here's a bigger and scarier spreadsheet, but this shows a little bit more of the SROI calculation using that kind of data. Now this is a real example of a charity that I recently did an analysis on based in Canada. And this particular charity fights inequality by working in really impoverished neighborhoods with at-risk students. And they have high-level programs like arts and robotics in schools to get students really interested in school again to keep them from dropping out. You can see those calculations, attribution, decay parameter, drop-off, those are all in there. We're not going to focus on that now. What I want you to do is look at the second column from the left, if you can read it from there, where it says with program. So the things that we found with this program were that not only were these students not dropping out of school, but we saw a 5% increase in their grades. 5% of the students improved their grades enough to get into a university. Decrease in dropout rate, improved behavior, a decrease in depression and anxiety among these students, reduction in drug and alcohol use, and a reduction in juvenile crime. Now again, we accounted for baseline here, so some of these students may have found other avenues to improve in these areas. So we subtracted out those baseline numbers. And then we used census data, we used the study you can see from the Canadian Council on Learning to establish some values for these things. So what's their difference in income 5 years after graduation if they were able to get into university versus if they were not? So these things really add up. And in the top left-hand corner, you can see the very top left says budget, and that is the input. So that's the amount of money it took to provide these programs for all of those clients. Now this is in thousands of dollars, so it's not 1,000, it's actually 1 million. But then if you look at the yellow box, you can see the total benefits there, the 13,000, and that is also in thousands of dollars. So this is really powerful information. This charity can now tell donors, can tell the world, listen, we're doing this work and we know it's expensive, but we can tell you that we are providing at least $12 worth of return to society and to these students based on every single dollar that is donated. So that's really hard data that they can publish now. Like I said before, there's limitations. There's a lot of benefits that are really hard to monetize, and that's where the context of the whole report comes in. Also focusing on the monetization alone. If people look at your study and look only at that number and not the context, then they don't get the whole story. It also takes a lot of time and resources to do this sort of study, to do the background research and to do the success rate research within the business or the charity itself. Obviously, there's issues with some of the subjectivity, and like I said, there's organizations working to get around some of these. So why does all of this matter? It matters because it's really easy to throw our time, energy, and money into causes that we care about. But good intentions have historically had a lot of negative consequences on the people we're trying to help. So it is really essential that we think deeply about the impact that we're having, both negatively and positively, that we use that for measuring our success, that we use it for where we're putting our money, and that we use it for planning ahead if we're involved in a business or a charity. Thank you.